If you're enjoying this story, please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel for more tales from the Old West. Your support helps us bring you these frontier stories every week. The morning mist clung to the pine trees like ghostly fingers as Thomas McKenna swung his axe with practiced precision. Each strike echoed through the Montana wilderness, a rhythmic sound that had become his daily prayer. The year was 1873, and winter's grip was loosening its hold on the mountain valley where he'd built his modest cabin. Thomas wiped the sweat from his weathered brow, his calloused hands gripping the axe handle. 4 years had passed since consumption took his beloved Sarah, leaving him to raise their 4 children alone. The youngest, little Emma, barely remembered her mother's face, while 10-year-old Samuel had become the man of the house in ways no child should. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made Thomas pause mid-swing. Visitors were rare in these parts, and unexpected ones often meant trouble. He set down his axe and walked toward the cabin where his children were likely finishing their morning chores. The rider emerged from the tree line, hunched over the saddle, moving slowly, as if every step caused pain. As the horse drew closer, Thomas realized the rider was a woman, her dark hair falling in tangled waves from beneath a worn bonnet. Her dress was travel-stained and torn in places, and something about her posture suggested she was carrying more than just the weight of her journey. The horse stopped near the cabin's porch, and the woman swayed dangerously in the saddle. Thomas rushed forward just as she began to fall. He caught her gently, immediately noticing the rounded curve of her belly beneath the faded fabric of her dress. She was with child, and from the looks of it, not far from her time. Her skin was pale as fresh snow, and her breathing came in short, labored gasps. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" Thomas called softly, cradling her against his chest. Her eyes fluttered open, revealing the deepest brown he'd ever seen, filled with exhaustion and something that looked like fear. She tried to speak, but only managed a whisper that he couldn't quite catch over the mountain wind. Samuel appeared at the cabin door, his younger siblings clustering behind him like curious sparrows. "Pa, what happened?" the boy asked, his voice carrying the weight of responsibility that had settled on his shoulders too early. Thomas could see the concern in his son's eyes, the same protective instinct that had kept their family together through the darkest times. "Help me get her inside, son," Thomas said, lifting the woman carefully. She was lighter than he'd expected, too light for someone carrying a child. As they moved toward the cabin, her eyes opened again, and she managed to whisper a single word: "Please." The desperation in that one word told Thomas everything he needed to know about her circumstances. The cabin's interior was simple but warm, with a stone fireplace crackling softly and the smell of pine logs mixing with the aroma of morning coffee. Thomas laid the woman on his own bed, the one he'd shared with Sarah, while the children gathered around with wide eyes. Emma, barely 5, clutched her rag doll tightly, sensing the gravity of the moment. "Mary, fetch some water and clean rags," Thomas instructed his 8-year-old daughter. "Samuel, stoke the fire. We need to get her warm." The children moved with practiced efficiency, their father's calm voice providing the anchor they needed in this unexpected situation. Thomas had learned that children responded better to action than to uncertainty. As the woman's breathing steadied, Thomas noticed details that painted a picture of her recent hardships. Her wedding ring was gone, leaving only a pale band of skin on her finger. Her boots were worn through at the soles, and her hands bore the rough calluses of someone who'd been working hard, likely harder than a woman in her condition should have been. She stirred as Mary brought the water, and Thomas knelt beside the bed. "Ma'am, you're safe now. Can you tell me your name? His voice was gentle, the same tone he'd used to comfort his children through nightmares and scraped knees. He'd learned that patience was often the first gift you could give someone who'd been through hell. "Margaret," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind that rattled the cabin's windows. "Margaret Wheeler, my husband." He's gone. The words came out in fragments, as if each one cost her something precious. Thomas could see the effort it took for her to speak, the way her hands trembled as she tried to pull the blanket closer around her. The children exchanged glances, recognizing the familiar pain of loss. They'd worn those same expressions when their mother had taken her final breath, that mixture of confusion and grief that children shouldn't have to understand. Thomas felt his heart clench, not just for this stranger, but for the memories her words brought rushing back. "Gone? How?" Thomas asked gently, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Death was a frequent visitor in the frontier, arriving without warning and leaving families shattered in its wake. Whether it was disease, accident, or violence, the result was always the same. Someone left behind to pick up the pieces and find a way to keep going. Margaret's eyes filled with tears that she seemed too exhausted to shed. Fever took him 3 weeks ago. "I've been traveling since then, trying to find somewhere, anywhere." Her voice broke, and Thomas could hear the desperation that had driven her to keep moving despite her condition. The frontier could be merciless to a woman alone, especially one carrying a child. Thomas felt the weight of decisions settling on his shoulders. He looked at his children, seeing Sarah's compassion reflected in their young faces. Samuel nodded slightly, understanding passing between father and son without words. Even little Emma seemed to grasp that this woman needed their help, her small hand reaching out to touch Margaret's arm with innocent gentleness. "You'll stay here?" Thomas said, the words coming out more firmly than he'd intended. "At least until the baby comes, and you're strong enough to travel, if that's what you want." The offer hung in the air between them, heavy with implications that neither of them fully understood yet, but both recognized as necessary. Margaret's eyes widened, and for the first time since her arrival, Thomas saw something besides desperation in them. "I can't. I don't have anything to offer in return. No money, no—" Her voice trailed off, and Thomas could see the pride warring with necessity in her expression. The frontier taught people to be self-reliant, but it also taught them when to accept help. "You don't need money," Thomas said, settling back on his heels. "We'll figure out the rest as we go." He glanced at his children, who were watching the exchange with the serious expressions of those who'd learned too young that life was fragile, and kindness was sometimes the only thing that stood between survival and disaster. The days that followed settled into a rhythm none of them had expected. Margaret proved to be stronger than her arrival had suggested, insisting on helping with household tasks despite Thomas's protests. She mended clothes with skilled fingers, her stitches neat and small, and taught Mary how to braid her hair in ways that stayed put during the day's work. Samuel found himself drawn to her quiet strength, the way she never complained, despite the obvious discomfort of her condition. She listened to his stories about school and his friends back in town with genuine interest, asking questions that made him feel important and heard. It had been a long time since an adult had paid attention to what he had to say. Little Emma adopted Margaret almost immediately, following her around the cabin like a devoted puppy. The woman's gentle patience with the child's endless questions and need for attention filled a gap that Thomas hadn't even realized was there. Emma had been too young when Sarah died to remember having a mother's constant presence, but she seemed to recognize it now. 7-year-old James was more cautious, watching Margaret with the careful eyes of a child who'd learned that adults could disappear without warning. But even he began to warm to her when she helped him with his letters, her soft voice encouraging him through the difficult words with a patience that never seemed to waver. The cabin itself seemed to come alive with Margaret's presence. She had a way of making small improvements that transformed the space without changing its essential character. Wildflowers appeared in a jar on the kitchen table, and the smell of fresh bread joined the familiar sense of pine and wood smoke that had always defined their home. Thomas found himself looking forward to the end of his workdays in a way he hadn't since Sarah's death. Coming home to the sound of children's laughter and a woman's voice singing softly as she worked brought back memories that were painful and comforting in equal measure. He tried not to think too hard about what it meant, focusing instead on the practical necessity of the situation. But necessity had a way of becoming something else when you weren't paying attention. Thomas began to notice the way Margaret's eyes lit up when she laughed, how her hand moved unconsciously to her belly when she was thinking, the careful way she moved through the cabin as if she was afraid of taking up too much space. These observations came to him unbidden, settling into his awareness like snow accumulating on a windowsill. One evening, as they sat around the fire after the children had gone to bed, Margaret spoke about her late husband. "Robert was a good man," she said, her voice soft with memory. "He wanted to be a teacher, but there wasn't much call for that where we lived. He took work where he could find it, always talking about the school he'd open someday." The wistfulness in her voice made Thomas's chest tight. "What about you?" Thomas asked, feeding another log to the fire. "What did you want to do?" It was a question he'd never thought to ask Sarah, taking for granted that her dreams had aligned with the life they'd built together. Now he wondered if that had been fair, if there had been things she'd wanted that she'd never spoken about. Margaret was quiet for so long that Thomas thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I wanted to have a garden. A real garden, not just vegetables for eating, but flowers and herbs and fruit trees, somewhere beautiful where children could play and learn about growing things." Her hand moved to her belly again, and Thomas understood that she was talking about more than just plants. The image she painted settled into Thomas's mind like a seed finding fertile ground. He could see it. The cleared space behind the cabin where the sun hit just right, rows of vegetables giving way to flower beds, fruit trees marking the boundaries of their property, children running between the plants, their laughter mixing with the sound of bees and the rustle of leaves in the mountain breeze. "There's good soil out back," he said, the words coming out before he'd fully thought them through. "Gets sun most of the day, ground's clear enough that it wouldn't take much work to prepare for planting." He wasn't sure if he was talking about spring planting or something larger, but Margaret's eyes brightened in a way that made his chest feel warm. As Margaret's pregnancy progressed, the boundaries of their temporary arrangement began to blur. Thomas found himself including her in plans that extended beyond the immediate future, asking her opinion on things that mattered to the family's long-term welfare. She, in turn, began to speak of ideas and improvements as if she expected to be around to see them implemented. The children adapted to their expanded family with the resilience that seemed to be built into young hearts. Samuel took on the role of protective older brother with Margaret's unborn child, discussing names and making plans for teaching the baby important skills like fishing and tracking. Mary practiced her maternal instincts by fussing over Margaret's comfort, bringing her extra pillows and making sure she ate enough. James overcame his initial wariness and began to seek Margaret's approval for his small accomplishments, the way he'd once sought his mother's attention. Emma simply accepted Margaret as a permanent fixture in their world, the way children accept all changes that bring them comfort and security. To her, Margaret had always been there and always would be. The baby arrived on a night when the spring storms were raging outside, thunder echoing through the valley like the voice of an angry god. Thomas had ridden hard to fetch the midwife from town, his heart pounding with a fear he hadn't felt since Sarah's difficult labor with Emma. By the time he returned with the weathered woman, Margaret was well into her travail. Mrs. Henderson, the midwife, took charge with the efficient calm of someone who'd delivered hundreds of babies in conditions ranging from comfortable to catastrophic. Thomas found himself relegated to the kitchen with his 4 children, all of them listening to the sounds coming from the bedroom with the tense attention of soldiers waiting for battle to begin. Samuel paced the small space like a caged animal, his 10-year-old frame trying to carry the weight of adult responsibility. Mary sat with Emma on her lap, both girls unusually quiet as they processed the gravity of what was happening. James pressed himself against Thomas's side, seeking the comfort of physical contact in the face of something too big for his young mind to fully comprehend. The hours stretched on, marked by the rhythm of the storm outside and the periodic sounds from the bedroom that made Thomas's hands clench into fists. He'd been through this before, but that didn't make it any easier. If anything, knowing how quickly things could go wrong made the waiting more difficult, not less. Finally, just as the storm was beginning to subside, they heard the sound they'd all been waiting for, the thin, indignant wail of a newborn baby. Thomas felt his knees go weak with relief, and he saw his own emotions reflected in the faces of his children. They'd all been holding their breath without realizing it, and now they could finally exhale. Cease. Henderson emerged from the bedroom 20 minutes later, her sleeves rolled up and her expression satisfied. "You have a healthy baby girl," she announced, wiping her hands on her apron. "Mother's doing fine, though she's tired. She's asking for you," she added, looking directly at Thomas with an expression he couldn't quite read. Thomas entered the bedroom to find Margaret propped up against the pillows, her hair damp with sweat, but her eyes bright with exhaustion and joy. In her arms was a tiny bundle wrapped in one of Sarah's old quilts, a small red face visible above the soft fabric. The baby's eyes were closed, her tiny fists waving in the air as she made soft mewing sounds. "She's beautiful," Thomas said, his voice rough with emotion. He'd forgotten how small newborns were, how perfect and fragile they seemed in those first moments of life. The baby's hair was dark, like her mother's, and her skin had the translucent quality that all newborns shared, as if she was still partway between worlds. Margaret looked up at him with tears in her eyes. "I want to name her Hope," she said softly, "because that's what you gave me when I had nothing left. You gave me hope." The words hit Thomas like a physical blow, cutting through all the careful distance he'd tried to maintain and settling directly into his heart. The children were allowed to meet their new sister one at a time, each of them approaching the bed with the reverent awe that babies seem to inspire in the young. Samuel was especially gentle, his large hands careful as he touched the baby's tiny fingers. Mary cooed softly, already planning all the things she would teach her new sister. James was fascinated by how small Hope was, and Emma simply stared in wonder at this new addition to their family. As the days passed, the cabin settled into a new rhythm built around Hope's needs. Thomas found himself rising in the night to help with feedings, walking the floor with the baby when she was fussy, sharing the load in a way that felt natural and right. The children adapted to their roles as older siblings with enthusiasm, each finding their own way to help and contribute. Margaret recovered slowly but steadily, her strength returning as spring bloomed fully around them. She insisted on resuming her household duties as soon as she was able, but Thomas noticed that she moved through the cabin with a different kind of confidence now, as if she belonged there in a way that went beyond temporary necessity. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple, Hope sleeping peacefully in Margaret's arms, Thomas found himself thinking about the future in a way he hadn't in years. Not just the immediate future of getting through each day, but the long-term future of building something lasting and meaningful. "Margaret," he said, his voice careful and measured, "I've been thinking about what you said about gardens, about having a place where children can grow and learn." He paused, watching her face in the fading light. "I think this could be that place, if you wanted it to be." Margaret's eyes met his, and Thomas saw in them the same mixture of hope and fear that he felt in his own heart. They were both people who'd lost everything once before, and the prospect of risking their hearts again was terrifying. But they were also people who'd learned that life was too short and too precious to waste on fear. "Are you asking me to stay?" she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not just until I'm strong enough to travel, but really stay." "Does The question hung between them, heavy with implications that would change everything for both of them and all 5 children who were now part of their extended family. Thomas took a deep breath, thinking of Sarah and the life they'd built together, of the promises he'd made and the grief he'd carried. But he also thought of the laughter that had returned to his children's voices, the way Margaret's presence had brought warmth and life back to their home, the tiny baby who'd already wrapped herself around all their hearts. "I'm asking you to marry me," he said, the words coming out steady and sure, despite the way his heart was hammering in his chest. "Not because it's practical or convenient, but because I can't imagine our lives without you in them. Because you've made us a family again, and I want to make it official and permanent." Margaret's eyes filled with tears, but Thomas could see the joy shining through them. "Yes," she whispered, then stronger. "Yes, I'll marry you." Hope stirred in her arms, as if responding to the emotion in her mother's voice, and Thomas felt something settle into place in his chest, a feeling of rightness that he'd thought he'd never experience again. The wedding took place 3 months later, in the same church where Thomas had married Sarah 15 years earlier. The children stood as witnesses, all of them dressed in their best clothes and beaming with happiness. Samuel held Hope during the ceremony, his young face serious with the responsibility of being her protector and big brother. Margaret wore a dress that the women of the town had sewn for her, white fabric with tiny blue flowers that matched her eyes. Thomas had never seen her look more beautiful, and as they spoke their vows, he felt the weight of the past lifting from his shoulders, replaced by the bright promise of the future they would build together. The reception was simple but joyful, held in the church hall with food contributed by the entire community. Thomas watched his children dance and laugh with a lightness he hadn't seen in years, and he knew that they'd all found their way back to happiness together. Margaret moved through the crowd with Hope in her arms, accepting congratulations and good wishes with the quiet grace that had first attracted him to her. That night, as they tucked the children into bed in the cabin that was now truly their home, Thomas felt a peace he'd thought was lost forever. The house was full of the sounds of a living family, sleepy murmurs from the children, Hope's soft breathing from her cradle, Margaret's gentle humming as she moved through the rooms. The garden that Margaret had dreamed of became a reality that summer, with all the children helping to plant and tend the vegetables and flowers. Thomas cleared the land behind the cabin, and they worked together to create something beautiful and productive. The children learned about seeds and soil, about patience and the reward of hard work, about the miracle of growth and the satisfaction of harvest. Samuel proved to have his mother's gift for growing things, his careful attention to detail serving him well in the garden. Mary discovered that she had an eye for flower arrangements, creating beautiful bouquets that brightened the cabin throughout the growing season. James found joy in the physical work of planting and weeding, his energy channeled into something productive and meaningful. Emma simply loved being in the garden, her small hands always eager to help with whatever task was at hand. She talked to the plants as if they were friends, and Margaret swore that vegetables grew better when Emma was nearby. Hope, though still too young to walk, spent her days in the garden in a basket, watching the world with bright, curious eyes. As the seasons turned and their family grew stronger, Thomas realized that sometimes the greatest gifts came disguised as disasters. Margaret's arrival had seemed like a complication to their simple life, but it had actually been the answer to a prayer he hadn't known he was praying. She'd brought not just herself and Hope, but a completeness that had been missing from their lives. The cabin expanded over the years, as did the garden and the family's happiness. Thomas's logging business prospered, and he was able to provide well for his growing family. Margaret's dream of a place where children could grow and learn became a reality that exceeded even her original vision, and the sound of laughter became as much a part of their home as the smell of pine and wood smoke. Years later, when Hope was old enough to understand, Margaret would tell her the story of how she'd come to their family. She'd explain how sometimes the hardest moments in life led to the most beautiful outcomes, and how love could grow in the most unexpected places. Hope would listen with wide eyes, learning that families could be built in many different ways, but that love was always the foundation. What do you think would have happened if Thomas had turned Margaret away that first day? Share your thoughts in the comments below about the power of compassion and how small acts of kindness can change the course of multiple lives.